Hi, I'm Allison, and today Eric and I are going to talk about determining a research question.
So I noticed in a lot of your writing, and I mentioned this in a video that I just recorded, a lot of your research questions are very, very broad. And I understand the interest and motivation for those questions. They come from the news that you read every day, the issues that you hear about at a state and local level, questions about gender, ethnicity, student achievement, things like that, test scores, Common Core, all of these things. But what becomes problematic is that at a local level, those questions, and as you phrase them, are very difficult to answer. You don't necessarily have a sufficient data set, you don't have enough students or ways to measure or answer the types of questions you want. So our motivation today is to discuss how to narrow your research question or generate one at a reasonable level. And to do that, we're going to focus on a couple of examples.
So the first thing we want to start with is your setting. You need someplace that you can collect data. So say you were teaching a math class. You might ask something like, what are the effects of having students write explanations for a mathematical answer? And then you could implement something where you have students write some sentence explanations, and then see maybe on their next test, do they better understand those ideas that students you had in the past who didn't do it. So start with your setting and determine, well, what type of questions can I ask? What type of data do I have access to?
As another example, I've noticed that a number of you are concerned about achievement levels, focusing on ethnicity, focusing on gender, focusing on instructional type, and trying to understand if there's a difference between how students from in one group compare to students in another group. That can be a very interesting question. The responses to that are often in some of our highest level journals. However, the type of rigor and the level of depth you need to answer those questions are very difficult. It takes an immense amount of resources and an immense amount of time. Something I understand that you don't have, given how busy you are for this course and your program in general. So what I'd encourage you to do instead is to focus much more on giving a rich description of what occurs in your own local setting. So instead of focusing on the effects of something, you can also focus on rich description of what happens. So perhaps you give a lesson, or perhaps you give two lessons. And instead of just saying which one of these lessons is better or which approach is better, you can instead describe what happens with each approach. So that could be, how are these students thinking in the context of each one of these lessons? So rather than trying to make a merit judgment to decide which one of these lessons is better, you can say, this lesson afforded these certain things for my students, it afforded these certain things for the teachers in the classroom. It's much more powerful then to be able to give a rich description of what each lesson afforded, rather than just trying to synthesize it down to saying which one is better.
So data for that, if you did a lesson, you might interview students and see what they thought of it. Or you might try, maybe you usually lecture rather than having students work in groups. You might try having some lessons where they do group work and then interviewing students about which did they like better, which did they think that they learned more. So your data doesn't have to be in terms of numbers, or some of you said that you don't really like statistics. You may not have to make statistical comparisons. You can do a more qualitative study where you're trying to find out what students thought about something.
So our purpose in this video is to try and help you start to think about narrowing down your research question in your interest area. The reason that we're doing this now is this is very necessary for you to consider before you start doing your literature review. The last thing that we want you to do is jump headlong into your literature review without having solidly nailed down a particular question. So this week, as you start working on your articles and you start analyzing the methods in those articles, this will be a good introduction for you before you start diving into the literature. At the same time, we want to make sure that you are thinking frequently about your interest area and your research area going forward. All right?
I think that's
all we
it.
have.
Stay tuned for a coming video about how to do a lit review.
All right, bye.